I'm Susanna Marsden, a higher education consultant who helps to develop and support HE institutions in the UK and beyond. This podcast takes a deep dive into the roles of people who work in this hugely varied higher education sector. Each episode reveals what's involved in a specific role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. The higher education sector is continually adapting to the changing strategic and financial environment, and a particularly visible part of this adaptation is restructuring within many institutions. In this episode, I'm joined by three guests from inside and outside HE to reflect broadly upon restructure and redundancy, including how we talk about the topic in day-to-day working life, the impact it can have, how it's led, and the type of support that can be valuable in helping colleagues and institutions transition to a new phase. We also delve into the topic of who owns a career path and whether we need to change our approach to better embed career conversations into overall professional life. We will not have captured every angle of redundancy and restructuring in this episode, but what we aim to do is provide an important space for some reflections and advice. Andy, Helene, Jeremy, welcome to the podcast and thank you for being my guests today to talk about redundancy, restructuring and beyond. You each come from different professional backgrounds, both HE and other sectors. So I'm going to ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and your line of work. So Andy.
I'm Andy Windsor and I am the Interim Director of Student Life at the University of Kent.
And Helene.
I'm Helene Usherwood. I'm a Senior Partner at Quigley and we provide permanent, interim and board appointments to the public sector with very deep foundations within the higher education sector.
And Jeremy.
Thanks, Susanna. I spent my career in consumer goods, in household branded names, and working internationally with each of those companies like Johnson & Johnson and SC Johnson and McCormick. Now I have a consulting and coaching business. I lecture on change management and I've been on the board of the Teenage Cancer Trust for the last 10 years.
So welcome everyone. And kicking off our conversation, Jeremy, as you've just mentioned, you've worked in and with various sectors nationally and internationally within your career. What observations do you have about the extent to which redundancy is normalised in general professional life, or does it still hold a taboo?
I think it's shifting. I still think there is a challenge with the word because there's many working people today, and I'm one of them, that still recall a day when redundancies were not so common. But the world changes in reality and it's changing ever more quickly. So organisations have to react and they have to change themselves and they reshape what they offer. Sometimes they reshape their skill base and often reorganise. So as a result, there will be roles that are no longer required in an organisation. So the chances are today more and more people are likely to be impacted by that. There are no such things as jobs for life, which I think some people might recall back in the day. But the definition of redundancy is, the state of no longer being needed. But I think what many people find difficult is that they feel that that's the person as opposed to the role. In reality, at least in my experience, redundancy is more often than not the role, not the person. But I think the taboo, if there is one with the word, is more because the person feels that it's something that reflects on them. I would say there's an element of which generation you're from. So from my era, as it were, slightly older, people might experience anxiety, maybe even judgment, and therefore redundancy as a word feels a bit more taboo. People I've noticed in interviews try and avoid it. They'll try and avoid putting it on a CV. They'll try and avoid gaps on a CV. They'll call it something like career progression. Whereas I think younger workers, not that they are no less affected by it, but they tend to review it, I think, as part of a career progression. And especially in volatile sectors that we've seen on hospitality or something like tech or media. My two daughters are both in their 20s and have recently started working. And already in their organisations, they've heard the conversation about reorganisation and redundancy mentioned, and it's become sort of part of the normal vernacular. Whereas I'm not even sure I heard that till I was probably in my 40s. So still a challenge, I think, for today, but becoming less so.
And Helene, the prospect of redundancy can come at the right time for some people, depending on their personal and professional situation. But I guess for many other people, it's prospect or reality. It's not a choice, is it? And it can have a significant impact.
Yeah, for sure. I think redundancy, if there's ever a right time, it's probably for those senior professionals who might be sort of thinking about potential portfolio careers or consultancy work, and that redundancy package might provide something of the financial cushion to establish themselves. It might be those who are sort of approaching retirement and weren't quite ready to make the leap, but also individuals who might be contemplating a bit of a sector change too, but felt trapped by financial commitments. Potentially redundancy package creates the permission and means to pivot into new careers. But I also think there's those with entrepreneurial ambitions as well, who've maybe been building the side projects. It actually gives them a bit more of a runway to pursue those full time. I think when it genuinely becomes a bit more stressful, if you like, it's maybe those mid-career professionals who maybe have the more significant financial commitments, whether that's mortgages, elderly parent care. You might be looking also at single income households where there's no financial buffer. We've also seen people who've perhaps recently relocated for a role and made some pretty major life decisions based on that role security, and that all changes. We've also seen international staff facing some visa implications with the loss of a job too. And I think when it does become stressful, it's also for those individuals whose professional identity is deeply tied to that institution as well. And for them, it's a loss of both the role and the community that they're part of too. I think there's mental health impact considerations too with that. Potentially a loss of sort of professional identity. It can be quite profound in those long-serving staff. And as silly as it might seem, it's potentially that disruption to that daily routine as well, that really affects people, and that social isolation, and also that total anxiety that will be raised about future employability as well. I think for some people it's a bit of a grief process that feels very real when they're going through that mourning the loss of a potential role and status and institutional belonging too. But I mean, what we observe is that those that acknowledge those feelings and seek the support early on tend to recover the momentum much quicker. I think pretending it hasn't affected you rarely works. And the mental health dimension, I think, is often underestimated by institutions that focus purely on the financial settlements. So I think access to professional support during notice periods makes a really significant difference to the outcomes of that process.
And Andy, I mean, you work in the higher education sector, as you said earlier, currently as Interim Director of Student Life at the University of Kent, and you've worked in the sector for over the past 20 years. What are your reflections on what's happening across the sector in relation to roles and restructures at the moment and its implications on day-to-day institutional life?
I think it goes without saying that it's been an incredibly difficult time for everyone in the HE sector at the moment. I think part of that is because for a relatively long period of time before the current difficulties, a lot of universities were relatively safe and stable organisations. You think back to the earlier part of the millennium, and it was a time of growth for the sector. And I think there are a lot of people who grew through their posts during this time and got acclimatised to that mode of operation, such that when challenges came along, the natural instinct was to try and grow themselves out of the problem. I think for some institutions for a while that worked, and then when we saw a slowdown in the international student market and lower tariff institutions started to see more of their student populations snaffled by higher tariff institutions who had started taking more of an advantage of the number cap coming off, I think it really started to get a lot more difficult. And where we are now is that we have a shrinking of the sector with a number of organisations going through multiple savings exercises in order to address their current financial financial challenges. And I think that adds to the complexity of things, because you can have multiple change programs being progressed either at the same time or in close succession to each other. In less pressured times, organisations would take a more considered view over how much actual change capacity there was in the institution, how much could they achieve, how much could people take. But sometimes the scale of the financial challenge that people are facing is such that that just isn't possible, and you have to go through with things in a way that you would, if you had more of a chance, you would prefer to spread out. This said, I do think it's about balancing the opportunity that change brings to create positive impacts against the negative impact that you'll be creating within your staff team. There's no easy way to undertake a restructuring and redundancy exercise. And I know there'll be some who say, actually, the best thing to do is just to rip the plaster off and to get on with it, get it over and done with. But I think there is a way to do these exercises that acknowledges the difficulties that people naturally experience and give consideration to what your organisation's going to be left with in terms of emotional scar tissue from the process that you've been through. Because at the end of any process, you're still going to have to operate in that new organisation. And ultimately, you want to try and minimise the amount of trauma and baggage that people are carrying around with them into the new world.
And to pick up on a point that Jeremy made at the start, the redundancy word, that dictionary definition of no longer being needed or useful. I mean, it's a hugely challenging term, isn't it, when used in isolation? And unsurprisingly, it is the terminology that people often hold on to when plans are announced in an organisation. Andy, you've recently led some organisational changes at Kent. What approach did you take to framing your proposals for colleagues?
I think we had to be honest with people as to the reality of our situation. We were facing some significant financial challenges, and we had to make sure that we were shaping the size of our teams according to the resources that we actually had available. I think people had a general understanding of that, both at an institutional and a sector level. But I don't think for some they truly engaged with the reality of it until the proposals were in front of them and it had become really real for them. That was tough, because I was extremely conscious that when I arrived to lead the process that I had responsibility for, colleagues had been aware for some time that a change was coming, but they didn't know exactly what that change was going to look like, what the structures were that they were going to be presented with. So for me, it was really important that we removed that information gap as quickly as possible. I found that where there is uncertainty or a bit of a vacuum, people will fill that with speculation, which is natural, but it's also extremely unhelpful in terms of people's emotional states. At Kent, we were also in the situation where this was the third change process that people had experienced in a small number of years. So there was a sense that both the organisation had been continuously in flux, and that the group of staff we were working with were worn down and fatigued by their experiences of those change processes. And I think to address that, I tried to focus on a couple of things. Firstly, I made it really clear about acknowledging the emotional state of the organisation, about how difficult things had been, how it would feel for everyone. Not to linger on it for too long, but to just properly recognise people's situations. There are a number of people who had long-standing emotional connections to the organisation, which were being damaged by the processes that we were going to. So I wanted to make sure that people understood that we were aware of that. I then looked to focus on the opportunities that came out of the change. Again, not in a toxically positive sense where you kind of ignore the challenges, because I think people just find that really fake. But in a way that asks people to think about, the things that we might be able to change and do differently as a result of going through the restructuring process, and how the difficulties that we've had previously we could resolve by doing things in a new way.
And you mentioned you arrived at Kent to lead those changes. You're in an interim leadership role there. To what extent would you say that's had a bearing on how you've led the work?
I think there's been some definite benefits in some ways and some challenges in others. Because I was fresh into post, I wasn't coming with the burden of all of the history that you have when you've been in an organisation for a long time, which meant that I could look at things in a more objective manner, I think, than if you've been in an organisation for some time. I wasn't affected by having that consideration of the relationships that I had with colleagues that had been built up over many years. I hadn't built the structure, so I wasn't having to disassemble something I created myself. And I think those are factors that have to be acknowledged when you're asking existing managers to lead processes within their organisation. So in that sense, there were less constraints. The counterpoint to that was that I didn't have the institutional knowledge and the historic context that I think always needs consideration when you're building new structure proposals. And to address that, I was just really open and upfront about it in the consultation. I said that, there'll be things that I won't have seen or thought about from my position, and therefore I was going to need the active engagement and response from those team leaders who are much closer to the actual delivery of the work. I think being, honest and open about those things, being really clear about what we could change within the process and within the proposal that we pulled together after actively listening to the concerns that people were bringing to us, adopting their suggestions where we could. I think those were really vital things in terms of building buy-in for what we were doing. I do think it's a balance, though. If you're too wedded to existing ways of doing things and simply can't see another way of delivering the activity that you're there to deliver, that naturally constrains your thinking. And I've had to have open conversations with one of my managers particularly, who said to me, look, I told you I would need this many people to deliver the work, and you've given me less than that. To which my response was, well, I know it's difficult, but I could only afford to give you this number of people. So you need to look again at how we do the work differently with that new level of resource. And that's really tough, because you're changing processes, you're changing ways of working, again, working with people who built them in the first place. To some, that can seem impossible at first glance. And I think that can lead to people trying to simply do what they did before, but with less people. But if you go down that line of trying to push the same amount of work down a smaller funnel, all you end up with is burnout. And I think the benefit that I brought was I was coming to the organisation with fresh eyes, having worked in a number of different organisations previously. That meant that I could authentically express a message that there are many different ways of getting to the outcomes that you want, doing things differently to achieve what you want. And sometimes that does mean slaying some sacred cows and stopping doing some stuff that you otherwise might not necessarily want to.
Jeremy, Andy talked there a few moments ago about that people-centred approach he's aimed to take at Kent. You've seen these types of activities being run in various different sectors. Can you give us some insight about what you've seen work well?
Yeah, sure. I've seen them work in different sectors. I've seen them work in different countries across the world. And there are some similarities around things that work well and work not so well. For me, when you're changing something in an organization, especially where it involves people, one of the cornerstones of change management is the case for change. In other words, why is the change being made? People might not necessarily agree with it, but it's always being honest to inform them of why you're actually changing something in the first place, because then they're likely to at least understand and be more appreciative of the conversations that you're going to have. I think also early communication, even I would say if you're not totally sure of all of the details, are still better, because people trust you more if you're trying to be open and honest. It reduces uncertainty to a degree for them, and it allows people involved to sort of prepare not just practically for things that might be coming, but also emotionally, because otherwise a shock can be quite distressing and difficult for people. Structured support, and by that I mean things like outplacement services, I think can help for some people. But as I'll talk about a little later, it's probably more needed to be bespoke to the individual. Or I think Helen talked about mental health support. That's also much more prevalent these days, and especially if this is a surprise for people. But I think if you do that, it leaves people feeling much more valued and supported, and it improves engagement and people leaving on positive terms, but also for the people who are not leaving. Because to be totally honest, whilst there might be a degree of confidentiality about these kind of conversations, human beings talk, and if you're leaving, you'll talk to somebody who's staying. So how these things are done will get communicated back to people. I think, though, where it's particularly worked well also is where you preserve people's dignity and respect in the conversation. You have, as far as you can, do conversations face to face. I've had some of these difficult conversations across Europe, and I've made the point of going out to the individual countries and also take time to absorb it. If you are having several conversations in a day, don't back them up so it looks rushed and people don't have the time, because everybody's different in how they react. I mentioned one size does not fit all. People have different circumstances, as I think Andy was alluding to. It's important to try and find out how you can potentially help. And don't ignore the emotional factors. You've got to communicate things like payoffs and severance packages and so on. But there is an emotional connection here that if you take the time to deal with, then there'll be a sort of long-term reputational positive as a result of that. The last thing I'd say is around follow-up, because we've touched on the fact that there are going to be people who are affected by this who are leaving an organization, but there are other people who are remaining. And I've heard the concept of survivor guilt, people feeling uncomfortable that they were staying, and of course naturally maybe fearing, well, will there be further change? And it's almost inevitable that sort of productivity and people's general outlook drops off at that point. So to the extent that you can follow up with people who are remaining, and again, without being dishonest, to reassure them as far as you can and to be transparent, I think that always works much better.
And Helene, as an executive search professional, you help appoint the right people into roles whose remit may at some point include the need to restructure or make redundancies. What sort of qualities and experiences would you say underpin leading these situations well?
I think there's some real essential leadership qualities that you'd be looking for. And Andy mentioned that acknowledgement of the emotional state of the organisation. And I think that therefore requires an individual to have high levels of emotional intelligence, to really hold the human dimension side of it alongside the business rationale. It's about having the courage to have difficult conversations rather than delegating inappropriately. Jeremy's spoken already about the transparency, but it's also the self-awareness about your own individual emotional response during the process too. If we know that this is going to be part of someone's future role, that previous exposure to organisational change is really helpful. They understand more then around the ripple effects beyond immediate decisions. Potentially, they've also experienced their own setbacks in their career at some point too. I think that builds genuine empathy for those that might be affected. And it's also a track record of managing diverse stakeholder expectations under that pressure piece. That is also really helpful. I think, though, what distinguishes exceptional leaders through these processes is that they remain visible throughout, that they're not disappearing when it does get uncomfortable. They do consider the impacts on remaining staff, not just those departing. And I think they invest properly by way of outplacement counselling and practical support. There is also something about a valuable learning dimension too. There is something about managing redundancy processes well, and that it provides genuinely valuable professional development. You observe how to separate from a role from the person. You manage the consultation processes, and you maintain team morale during those periods of uncertainty. And those are really valuable lessons. I think, though, the reality for the senior appointments, when we're recruiting to executive positions, restructuring experience is increasingly valued. And I think if you're stepping into a senior HE leadership role, you'll likely face something of these decisions. So leaders who've managed those processes thoughtfully emerge with more enhanced capability, and it becomes part of the executive skill set. So it's not necessarily something to hide by way of CVs and interviews either.
You've all mentioned support for individuals affected by restructures or redundancy, and clearly that's a critical part of making processes run as well as they can. And I guess that ranges right from the point that you've made about initial conversations and transparency, right the way through to ongoing investment in supporting colleagues in their next steps. Helene, Anderson Quigley takes a role in outplacement support, a phrase that Jeremy used a few moments ago. Can you say a bit more about what that means and what that support looks like, and especially for people who might be thinking about new directions?
Outplacement is about providing professional support to help individuals transition from their current role to their next career opportunity. It's typically funded by the employer as part of the redundancy package, and it bridges that gap between leaving the organisation and securing the next position. I mean, what it looks like in practice is about providing one-to-one career coaching to explore those options, identify some of those transferable skills. And for the individual, it's about developing your own unique value proposition as well. So what is it you can take from that role into your next that will be deemed attractive? We also help with CV and LinkedIn profile development. And that's maybe particularly important for senior professionals who haven't been job hunting for a number of years. Interview preparation, personal brand positioning, strategic job search guidance, so where to look, how to network effectively. And then as we take people potentially through a process of recruitment, it's also happy to help by way of salary negotiations as well. I think for people considering new directions, outplacement becomes particularly valuable when you've spent a career potentially in single institutions or sectors. It's helping translate some of that academic or professional services experience into language that other sectors might well understand. It's also the exploration of portfolio careers, consultancy, non-executive director roles, or complete sector changes too. And it provides a bit of a reality check too about market conditions, salary expectations, and where you might then ultimately end up. I think it's also an external perspective which helps shift a mindset from, oh no, what's happening to me, to what's possible for me. And it's about rebuilding some of that confidence that can be damaged by redundancy experiences, and creates a bit of structure and momentum too.
And Jeremy, to what extent do you think that outplacement support of the type that Helene has just described there is helpful for people who are looking to get a job, similar to the one that they've had previously?
Hugely valuable, hugely relevant. The reality is, if this happens to you, even if you're expecting it, I think you lose confidence. That's natural. I think you do feel isolated because you've gone from the sort of structure that an organization provides you to, you're on your own, and you might speak to the people you used to work with who'll ask you how you're going, but you are on your own. I mean, you are trying to find a new role. And also you want to be connected with somebody who actually understands your situation. So outplacement, for all of the reasons that Helene outlined, are extremely helpful. I mean, if you've been in an industry for a while, and most people, thankfully, are not having to go through redundancy that often, you might not have your CV or resume up to date. You might not have had to write a cover letter. You might not have your LinkedIn profile updated. I think also there's some additional things that an outplacement support can provide. They are very good at providing market insight, because they understand the market. They've often heard about who might be hiring. They can guide you on things like salary benchmarks, which employees are emerging that you might not be aware of, especially if you've been out of the market for a while, which is quite helpful for somebody returning to a similar role or looking for a similar role. One of the most challenging things is to land an interview, and they can help support that. But once you get an interview, is to obviously help you prepare and make sure that you stand out, the unique value proposition that Helene talked about, and why you bring something that's not only unique, but it's going to be relevant to them. So I think, the overall feeling is one that you get confidence, motivation, the impact on self-esteem can be quite damaging. So the outplacement support, if it's done well, and it's bespoke because it needs to be, can help individuals rebuild the confidence, handle the fact that it might have been a role that was no longer required, but to the extent that they felt it was them, you can start to get your head around that and start to get a bit of momentum back in the job search. I mentioned bespoke and tailored. I do think that's really important because every single person is different and unique.
And Andy, you've been leading the process of restructure at Kent, well, not the whole university, but within your directorate. Can you tell us a bit more about the approach you've been taking to supporting colleagues through that?
The first point for me is about the simple act of recognising the emotionality of the situation. I've had some really lovely comments from colleagues about how human my approach has been, but I don't think that's because I'm doing anything particularly special. I think it's more because it's really easy for people who are leading processes to drop into a more technical or bureaucratic frame and close down when they receive some of the natural criticism that comes from people during change processes. I think that's a very human defence mechanism, particularly where that criticism, often filled with some, understandable anger from those affected, starts to feel very, very personal. And it's really difficult, I think, to depersonalise that and to see that pain and the worry that people have isn't really about you, it's about the situation that those people are in. But I think that's because all of us, those who are leading processes and those who are affected by them, we get so emotionally connected to our work that separating out the two can be really tough, and so we revert back to focusing on the process, or at worst we look for things to blame that are external to yourself, which is ultimately just a really bad tactic, because it just adds, the net effect is it adds more negativity to the overall process, and I think ultimately it makes you individually look quite weak and unconfident. Supporting colleagues, I think, is about creating spaces for people to have time aside to unload their burdens. That can be with managers, but it's also with peers and their support networks outside of organisations. And through our process, I was really pleased with how colleagues came together at times to support each other, where people were feeling those stresses and concerns. And that was through really simple things like taking each other for coffee or going for lunch or going to the pub. It was, you need that balance of the formal and the informal spaces for people to talk through their feelings and get those answers to address their concerns if you're going to properly support people in these areas.
And Helene, reflecting on what you, Andy and Jeremy have talked about in terms of support and support in its broadest sense, to what extent would you say organisations do place sufficient focus on providing support for colleagues? And what does sufficient look like when there are financial and resource constraints in many HEIs?
It's variable by way of the current state, of the sector. But I think some institutions really invest very well, others less so, and it really limits the support that they can give to their staff. But I feel sometimes that's slightly short-sighted, especially in terms of thinking about those longer term reputational costs as well. Sufficient looks like, even with constraints, I think there's some easy wins there. It's realistic timescales. Rushing consultation to save costs, I think, really damages the outcomes for everyone. There has to be proper resourcing of HR teams throughout these types of processes. They're often really stretched thin. For me, clear, honest communications throughout, rather than information being drip-fed too. Access to the most basic, if you like, of outplacement support. So group sessions rather than that bespoke one-to-one that we've spoken about. That would be great. I've also seen it where managers don't receive training and support to have the quality conversations with effective staff, and that's something that can be managed so easily. And I think also flexibility where possible. So have you considered extending notice periods, phased departures, all references being provided quite promptly. These are all parts of the process that can be managed without sort of significant investment. I think always about treating people with dignity, allowing time for proper handovers to protect that institutional knowledge as well, and maintaining that access to facilities, networks, alumni benefits where appropriate would also be something you could do without a huge budget too. But it's also, for me, it's about the visibility of the senior leadership. People remember who showed up during those really difficult times. I think it's important to think beyond the immediate situation as well. Those leaving will talk to peers, to the media, on social media. And I think remaining staff watch how colleagues are treated and will draw conclusions about their own security as well. And from a recruitment perspective, it becomes harder when your reputation for managing exits is poor. So there's that reputation dimension to all of this. HE is a small world. People do move around the sector. So how you manage that whole process really becomes part of your employer brand. And in competitive markets for talent, that is a really significant issue and matter to remember. So sufficient doesn't always mean expensive. And I think it's about being thoughtful and human, and it's investment in proper process design that supports and protects both individuals and the institution's future.
You've all talked about or referenced the future state, and the outcome of a restructure will be a differently formed department, team or service. And some people will have the same role, others will be in a new role, but overall there will be some form of difference to how things were before. Jeremy, in the organisational settings that you've experienced across your career, what have you seen work well and not so well in how that new state works through? And what type of support can be helpful to people in those contexts?
My experience is that organisations do not take as much time over this part, or the part that remains, that is left, that they do over the part that's changing, and especially people who are moving out. So first thing I'd say is you need a plan. You can't just turn up and do it and hope everything's going to be okay. What I've seen work well, and somewhat similar to what I said earlier, one of the cornerstones of change management is a very clear narrative and direction to explain to people why the restructures happened. Because you may have explained to people who have left, who were affected, but you need to explain it to the people who are staying. And what does the future look like, and how does their role contribute? Because I can guarantee all of these people, and I've been on the receiving end of this as well, will want to know, is this likely to impact me, and what will my role now be? I think leadership that handles this well is, number one, very visible, and number two, generally very empathetic. It's those leaders that spend time with teams afterwards, listening to concerns that they might have. We've talked a bit about the emotional impact of a change like this, and I think that's really important to make sure that leaders take on board. I think change these days, you have to do with people, not to people. Back in the day, it used to be, this is a change and this is what I want you to do. But if you want to get the most out of people, you want them to be on side and actually enthusiastic that they can shape the future, not just be told what to do. So the sooner that you can get them involved to make that new state as optimal as it can be is, in my mind, really important. You need to be clear on the role clarity. You alluded to the fact earlier on that some people's roles may have changed. They might not be working with the people that they've become used to working and probably liked. So you need to be clear on what that is. Things like job descriptions, responsibilities, reporting lines, of course. But if there is miscommunication on that, it can quickly unravel. And occasionally a symbolic moment of starting afresh, something like a relaunch meeting or a workshop or team building, getting everybody together and doing all of the above with them. Occasionally people, and this is often underestimated, people actually might need different skills or different training. That needs to be anticipated, especially where a role has shifted. And also, I think safe spaces where people can feed back and not feel vulnerable, especially if the feedback's not always positive. I changed an organization and 6 months later we asked for feedback, and we asked for feedback, good or bad. And actually the things that weren't working well were more insightful and more helpful than the things that we could at least change. And we wouldn't have been able to change if the people hadn't been involved in the change, nor that they felt comfortable to share them. So all of those things I think are useful. The final thing I think I just say is recognition when a simple, powerful, acknowledging effort sometimes that somebody's made a good contribution to reinforce the change you wanted, or the behavior or something somebody's done, can make a group or individuals feel very valued. And that's something that I would encourage people to do as much as they can do.
And Andy, you're now in that phase of leading the new state of things in your directorate. How's it going for you? And currently, where's your focus?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because we're also in Welcome Week at the moment, so really hit the ground running. I think we're in the early phases of implementation, and the focus for me is really about getting those new teams established and then getting them to review their work priorities and the work requirements that students and the institution has of our teams. We've got smaller teams than we had previously, and as I said before, you've therefore got to be really clear with people that you don't expect them to do exactly the same things that they were doing before. The positive there, though, is because of that, it's an opportunity to review the processes and the way of working and to think about how we can take out bits that are unnecessary or create inefficiency. We're really focused on getting teams working more closely together, because one of the effects of having gone through these previous change processes is that people have bunkered down and there's been a fair bit of siloing going on across the different teams. Again, I think that's natural when people feel threatened and they're insecure. It's really difficult to do all of that change, though, because I think we're always trying to change the engine on the car whilst it's barreling down the motorway to like 70 miles an hour. And it would be really great to go, right, okay, that's it. We're just going to turn the university off for a couple of months and we're going to fix the problems. But you just can't do that. You're always delivering the business as usual and trying to change it at the same time. But I know it's possible. I mean, we've just done some fantastic work on our timetabling processes, which I believe is genuinely sector leading and will have massive benefits for our students. And yeah, it's not without its challenges in terms of institutional adoption. But we did that while we were working on BAU. So it's very clear that we can do these things when we put our minds to them. And I'm just really keen to be helping people to see that they have the power to change those things they feel like they're struggling with day to day. It's getting them actively involved, like Jeremy said before.
Change is a constant, as you've just said there, Andy, and it's inevitable that there will be further organisational developments in the sector, which will include restructuring and impact on individual roles. Helene, in that context, what are your reflections on how we approach professional development or organisational development in its broadest sense? And are there any ways in which we need to rethink that approach to potentially, I guess, lessen the bumpiness or shock of restructures and redundancies?
Yeah, look, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? I think many institutions, just because they're so busy all of the time, there's this very reactive big bang when a crisis hits and then major restructure potentially then follows. I think there's probably a more effective approach that's around that continuous evolution, and it's the incremental changes aligned to your long-term plans as well. So staff who might experience some smaller, regular adjustments potentially can then cope a bit better with the larger shifts when they occur. And it's more about that transparent scenario planning that really helps people prepare psychologically as well. But I also think something around the professional development needs a bit of a reframe too. I think we're currently too focused on progression within current institutions and very narrow specialisms as well. So it's about potentially a broader emphasis on adaptability, transferable skills, external market awareness. And for me, career conversations shouldn't only happen when you're seeking promotion or facing redundancy either. I think you need to encourage staff to really maintain external networks, update their CVs regularly, understand how their skills translate elsewhere. And it's not about preparing people to leave, it's about building professional resilience as well. Embedding that into everyday culture, it makes career development then part of regular conversations, not just an annual tick box assessment. And it's normalising discussions about different career paths. And I think senior leaders should model more around this career resilience and openness about their own journeys as well. Some of us have had very squiggly career journeys, and that's not a bad thing. I think also keeping those LinkedIn profiles current is good professional practice, and it's not about sending out distress signals either and I'm suddenly looking. I think then there's some real practical benefits to all of that. Staff will feel more in control, less at the mercy of the decisions of their institution. And when restructuring occurs, people will then have the foundations rather than starting from scratch. It also reduces that piece around identity crisis. So professional identity becomes broader than their single role. And I also think it actually potentially improves retention because people will actively choose to stay within their organisation. I don't say this lightly because none of this eliminates the pain of redundancy, but I do think it significantly reduces the shock, improves that recovery time from it. And I think it also prepares people for what is an increasingly fluid employment landscape as well. And I think we're really feeling that in recent years across public sector. And I think it also benefits the whole of the higher education sector as well, dare I say it. We need mobile, adaptable professionals, not just those institutionally dependent ones, is what I would say.
And Jeremy, picking up there on what Helen's been talking about, what are your reflections on where the ownership of career paths lie?
So I think the ownership lies with the individual, but you cannot really do it effectively without the organisational support. So when I first started working many years ago, I just assumed that the organisation would take care of my career path. So I sort of sat back and then waited. And frankly, very early on, there were a couple of early promotions. And I remember thinking, this is great. And I didn't really have to think about it too much. But it became very clear to me that actually, as time went on, I have the most direct stake in my own career. The organisation cannot fully know or prioritise every person's aspirations and get them right. So it became very obvious to me that I needed to take ownership. But the organisation was extremely helpful in supporting, and quite often they've come up with things that I hadn't suggested. So, for example, at the beginning, when I was in marketing, which I really enjoyed, I was told that I had an aptitude for sales, and I remember thinking, how much I want to do sales, but they felt it was useful, and they could see the benefit of then going back into marketing with an appreciation of a different function, and it turned out to be really good. And then from that, when they realised that actually I was flexible, they asked about moving abroad. So I was the first person at the time to go and be posted internationally to the US. Both of those came from the organisation, but it gave me the sort of impetus to then start actually looking at, okay, well, I really enjoyed those experiences. What else can I inform the organisation about? Because they're only as good in supporting you as they are aware of your ambition. So I think that's really important, that nobody has a more direct stake in your career than you, and you should ultimately manage it, but have the organisation support it. So try and find things that you're really passionate about, that you've got a bit of an aptitude in, or you want to build a skill in, because organisations are often quite receptive to that. So you take the ownership with a good sprinkling of support from the organisation, and I think that'll work well. And try and be flexible where you can do, because you'll be amazed at what wonderful things happen along the way. And then there'll come a point at which you'll look back and you tend to regret things you don't do more than the things you do. So there's almost nothing I regret. I'm glad I've experienced all of them along the way.
And Andy, reflecting on the points that Helen and Jeremy have discussed there, where do you think the higher education sector is on that spectrum?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I've written on LinkedIn before about how I think universities aren't that great at having open conversations and creating space for open conversations about career development. I do think that the academic career path has historically been a bit of a problem here, and that it's been an unhelpful source of comparison for professional services colleagues who end up feeling a level of resentment when they don't manage to progress up the grades of the institution, or they do move up but then they hit a ceiling. I mean, my view's always been that you have to be open with people about where the opportunities are and where they aren't, and like Jeremy said, not be afraid to highlight things to people that they themselves might not have considered as their next move. I think as you move up grade levels, we all know the number of roles narrow, the churn in those roles lessens, and it means that you have to make a discernment about how long are you happy to sit in one position waiting for an opportunity to open up, realising that opportunity might not actually be something you're able to get because the institution might want to change that role, or they're looking for something different at the time when you're there. And so I think we have to work really hard with our people to reduce their fear of the outside world, to get them to be encouraged to talk openly about their ambitions and to think of the idea of moving on as not some kind of treachery to the organisation, but just have some of those open conversations about where our organisations will and won't be able to meet people's expectations and ambitions. Like Helen said, I don't think we should be afraid to see ourselves as talent incubators for other universities or for other businesses in our regions. Of course, we'll want to keep hold of our talent, but sometimes we have to accept that there are times when we can't, and when the best thing that we can do for our people is to help them leave. That's not a mentality that I've seen a lot of previously in universities, but I think that again might be a measure of what I said before about the relative stability of institutions, and I think the current instability actually provides an opportunity for us to change that. But I am conscious that that is a sea change in people's thinking, and I'm sure there'll be some listeners who will disagree with me on this.
Finishing up our conversation today, Andy, you're currently working at the University of Kent, as we know, which is due to form a multi-university group with the University of Greenwich, possibly from as soon as September 2026. Now, that prospect is new for the sector and it creates many opportunities, but I guess as well as an element of uncertainty. How are you planning on leading your team through this next period of time?
I think it's really about trying to keep people focused again on what is within their control and what isn't. We're at such an early stage of discussions about what the future model might look like that we've got no idea of what the future structures are going to be when they're fully defined. And whilst I know that can be concerning for people because again it's more uncertainty, at this point it's not anything that people can do anything about. So I'm really trying to encourage people to let go of the uncontrollable anxieties as much as they can. I've promised that not only will I share information with people as soon as I can, but also as soon as there's the chance to involve people in discussions about what future things might look like, I will bring them in. And I hope that people will trust me on this. Having seen that in the context of how I've worked with them through the restructuring process since I came in. I mean, as you say, I think it's a massive opportunity to do some truly sector-leading stuff. So who wouldn't be excited about an opportunity like that? I would have thought that lots of people would want to be involved in that. But opportunity always comes with risk, and with risk comes concerns. So I think we need to do what we can, again, to try and actively manage that emotional state of the organisation.
Andy, Helene, Jeremy, thank you so much for sharing your reflections in this episode and for being my guests today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Job Shadowing HE is proudly supported by the Association of Higher Education Professionals as a valuable source of professional insight. It was presented by Susanna Marsden, and you can find out more about her consultancy work at susannamarsden.co.uk. Audio production and music was by me, Rodri Marsden. Find out more about this podcast and hear previous episodes at jobshadowinghe.com.